This is really good for me to read out loud. I never use my mouth anymore very much. I'm that cluttered person in the apartment. Welcome. And on to chapter 2. Levels of recovering. Healing from complex PTSD is above all complex. This is important to emphasize because there are numerous one-dimensional approaches to trauma that bill themselves as cure-alls. In my opinion, however, singular approaches are unable to address all the levels of wounding that combine to cause CPTSD. Moreover, working with simplistic approaches can leave you stranded in toxic shame when you do not achieve the touted results. I was motivated to write this book in large because of the many times I sank into new levels of self-contempt when the last panacea therapy did not cure me. I will use the word key repeatedly to describe the various tasks upon which recovering hinges. This book offers a keychain of perspectives and techniques to unlock yourself from being what Alice Miller called a prisoner of childhood. Abusive and abandoning parents can injure and abandon us on many levels: cognitive, emotional, spiritual, physical, and relational. To recover, you need to learn how to support yourself, to meet your unmet developmental needs on each level that is relevant to your experience of childhood trauma. This chapter is a brief overview of the many tasks involved in CPTSD recovery. These tasks are explored at greater length in Part 2. The comprehensive table of contents at the beginning of this book will redirect you to further information on each of the topics covered in this chapter. Please allow yourself to also use the table of contents to explore sections of the book that pique your interest. Key developmental arrests in CPTSD. What follows is a list of some of the most common developmental arrests that occur in CPTSD. You may find that you experience a diminishment or absence of these key features of the healthy human being. Typically, survivors will vary on which and how many of these arrests relate to them. Factors affecting this are your 4F type, your childhood abuse neglect pattern, your innate nature, and any recovery work that you have already accomplished. So these are the common developmental arrests: self-acceptance, clear sense of identity, self-compassion, self-protection, capacity to draw comfort from relationship, ability to relax, capacity for full self-expression, willpower and motivation, peace of mind, self-care, belief that life is a gift, self-esteem, self-confidence. My efforts to nurture myself in these arrested areas of development were limited and spoiled in early recovery by a feeling of resentment. Why do I have to do this? Was a common internal refrain. Resentment that should have been directed towards my parents often boomeranged onto me and spoiled or thwarted my efforts at self-nurturance. Thankfully, ongoing recovery work helped remedy this resentment. It taught me to practice self-care in a spirit of giving to a child who needed and really deserved to be helped. I find it helpful to approach developmental arrests from the viewpoint of novelist David Mitchell Quip, that fire is the sun unwinding itself out of the wood. Find it helpful to approach developmental arrests from the viewpoint of novelist David Mitchell Quip, that fire is the sun unwinding itself out of the wood. Similarly, effective recovery is unwinding the natural potential you were born with out of your unconscious. This is your innate potential which may be, as yet, unrealized because of your childhood trauma. An especially tragic developmental arrest that afflicts many survivors is the loss of their willpower and self-motivation. Many dysfunctional parents react destructively to their child's budding sense of initiative. If this occurs throughout his childhood, the survivor may feel lost and purposeless in his life. He may drift through his whole life rudderless and without a motor. Moreover, even when he manages to identify a goal of his own choosing, he may struggle to follow through with extended and concentrated effort. Remedying this developmental arrest is essential because many new psychological studies now show that persistence, even more than intelligence or innate talent, is the key psychological characteristic necessary for finding fulfillment in life. I have worked with many survivors stranded in this form of adult helplessness. Those who recover from it typically do so by engaging extensively in the angering work of grieving that is discussed throughout this book. The ability to invoke willpower seems to be allied to your ability to healthily express your anger. With sufficient recovery, you can learn to manufacture your own volition. In the beginning, you can fake it until you make it. This is what Stephen Johnson calls the hard work miracle. What follows is a concluding comment about developmental arrests. Some survivors have confidence, but not self-esteem. In childhood, my own flight response got channeled into acquiring academic skills for which the outside world rewarded me. But the benefit of these rewards never penetrated my toxic shame enough to allow me to feel that I was a worthwhile person. My critic, like my parents, always found something flawed in me to contradict the feedback that I was getting. 99% on a test was never a cause for pride. Rather, it was the impetus for a great deal of self-criticism about the missing 1%. Like many other survivors that I've worked with, I developed the Impostor Syndrome. This syndrome contradicted the outside positive feedback that I was receiving. It insisted that if people really knew me, they would see what a loser I was. Eventually, however, I became confident in my intelligence enough, even though my self-esteem was still abysmal. Cognitive healing. The first level of recovery usually involves repairing the damage that Ptsd wreaks on our thoughts and beliefs about ourselves. Cognitive recovery work aims to make your brain user-friendly. It focuses on recognizing and eliminating the destructive thoughts and thinking processes you are indoctrinated with in childhood. Cognitive healing also depends on learning to choose healthy and more accurate ways of talking to and thinking about yourself. On the broadest level, this involves upgrading the story you tell yourself about your pain. We need to understand exactly how appalling parenting created the now self-perpetuating trauma that we live in. We can learn to do this in a way that takes the mountain of unfair self-blame off ourselves. We can redirect this blame to our parents' dreadful child-rearing practices. And we can also do this in a way that motivates us to reject their influences so that we can freely orchestrate our journey of recovery. This work then requires us to build a fierce allegiance to ourselves. Such loyalty strengthens us for the cognitive work of freeing our brains from being conditioned to attack so many normal parts of ourselves. Cognitive work is fundamental to helping you disidentify from the self-hating critic with which your parents inculcated you. As I am writing this, my son's friend synchronistically tells him, "This Lego creature I made spreads brain attack and eats away at the person." I marvel at the synchronicity and think, what a fitting image for the trauma-induced parent. Shrinking the critic. Early abuse and abandonment forces the child to merge his identity with the superego, the part of the child's brain that learns the rules of his caretaker in order to get and maintain acceptance. However, because acceptance is impossible to the CPTSD engendering family, the superego gets stuck working overtime to achieve the impossible. Perseverating on finding a formula to win over her parents, the child eventually embraces perfectionism as a strategy to make her parents less dangerous and more engaging. Her only hope is that if she becomes smart, helpful, pretty, and flawless enough, her parents will finally care for her. Sadly, continued failure at winning their regard forces her to conclude that she is fatally flawed. She is loveless not because of her mistakes, but because she is a mistake. She can only see what is wrong with or missing in her. Anything she does, says, thinks, imagines, or feels has the potential to spiral her down into a depressed abyss of fear and toxic shame. Her super ego fledges into a full-blown, trauma-inducing critic. Self-criticism, then, runs non-stop into a desperate attempt to avoid rejection-inducing mistakes. Drasticizing becomes obsessive to help the child foresee and avoid punishment and worsening abandonment. At the same time, it continuously fills her psyche with the stories and images of catastrophe. The survivor becomes imprisoned by a jailer who will accept nothing but perfection. He is chauffeured by a hysterical driver who sees nothing but danger in every turn of the road. Chapter 9 and 10 focus extensively on practical tools for shrinking your critic. The developmentally arrested healthy ego. Over time, the critic becomes more and more synonymous with the survivor's identity. The superego morphs into a totalitarian critic that trumps the development of a healthy ego. The ego develops later than the superego. Ego, contrary to popular usage, is not a dirty word. In psychology, the term ego represents what we typically mean when we use terms like myself or my identity. The healthy ego is the user-friendly manager of the psyche. Unfortunately, CPTSD-inducing parents thwart the growth of the ego by undermining the development of the crucial egoic process of self-compassion and self-protection. They do this by shaming or intimidating you whenever you have a natural impulse to have sympathy for yourself or to stand for yourself. The instinct is to care for yourself and to protect yourself against unfairness and is then forced to become dormant. Psychoeducation and cognitive healing. Becoming psychoeducated about CPTSD is the first level of addressing this poisonous indoctrination of your mind against your healthy ego. When you intricately understand how antagonistic your parents were to your healthy sense of self, you become more motivated to engage in the self-help processes of rectifying their damage. The more you identify their damage, the more you know what to fix. This is essential because without a properly functioning ego, you have no center for making healthy choices and decisions. All too often, your decisions are based on the fear of getting in trouble or getting abandoned, rather than on principles of having meaningful and equitable interactions with the world. You can learn to gradually replace the critic's toxic perspective with a viewpoint that supports you in your life and that stops you from unnecessarily scarring yourself. You are free now as an adult to develop peace of mind and a supportive relationship with yourself. A self-championing stance can transform your existence from struggling survival to a fulfilling sense of thriving. You can begin right now by inviting your instincts to self-compassion and self-protection to awaken and bloom in your life. Cognitive healing may have begun or been reinforced by reading what has preceded this. Hopefully you are having some epiphanies about what is at the core of your suffering. Some readers may have been searching for cognitive answers for years, and through their reading and therapy already created a sizable foundation for doing this work. At the same time, those who have only tried a cognitive behavioral approach to their healing their trauma may feel great resistance to hearing that cognitive work is important. If you are like me, you may have been introduced to it in a way that promised more than could be delivered. Cognitive tools are irreplaceable in healing cognitive issues, but they do not address all the levels of our wounding. They are especially limited in addressing emotional issues, as we will see below. In early recovery, the psychoeducation piece of cognitive work typically comes from the wisdom of others, teachers, writers, friends, and therapists who are more informed on this subject than we are. When psychoeducation reaches its most powerful level of effectiveness, however, it begins to morph into mindfulness. Mindfulness. Psychologically speaking, mindfulness is taking undistracted time to become fully aware of your thoughts and feelings so that you can have more choice in how you respond to them. Do I really agree with this thought, or have I been pressured into believing it? How do I want to respond to this feeling? Distract myself from it, repress it, express it, or just feel it until it changes into something else? Mindfulness is a perspective that weds your capacity for self-observation with your instinct of self-compassion. It is therefore your ability to observe yourself from an objective and self-accepting viewpoint. It is a key function of a healthy developed ego and is sometimes described as the observing ego or the witnessing self. Mindfulness is a perspective of benign curiosity about all of your inner experience. Recovery is enhanced measurably by developing this helpful process of introspection. As it becomes more developed, mindfulness can be used to recognize and disidentify from beliefs and viewpoints that you acquired from your traumatizing family. I cannot overstate the importance of becoming aware of your inner self-commentary. With enough practice, mindfulness eventually awakens your fighting spirit to resist the abusive refrains from your childhood and to replace them with thoughts that are self-supportive. Mindfulness also helps you to establish a perspective from which you can assess and guide your own efforts of recovering. Finally, it is important to note that mindfulness tends to develop and expand in a progressive manner to all levels of our experience: cognitive, emotional, physical, and relational. Mindfulness is essential for guiding us at every level of recovering, and we will examine this principle more closely throughout the book. Emotional healing. Traumatizing parents do as much damage to our emotional natures as they do to our thinking processes. Consequently, there is a great deal of recovery work that needs to be done on this level. This is especially true because of the damage of our wider society also does to our emotional natures. Recovering the emotional nature. This section is an updated version of an article I wrote in 1991. I originally wrote it as a prelude to my first book, The Tao of fully feeling. And it was written as an appeal to the general public to understand the consequences of trying to sanitize one's emotions. Thankfully, the response I received encouraged me to complete that book, which is a guide to overcoming the familial and societal damage meted out on children's emotional life. The survivor who is seeking a healthy relationship with his emotional being will strive to accept the existential fact that the human feeling nature is often contradictory and frequently vacillates between opposite polarities of feeling experiences. It is quite normal for feeling to change unpredictably along continuums that stretch between a variety of emotional polarities. As such, it is especially human and healthy to have shifts of mood between such extremes as happy and sad, enthused and depressed, loving and angry, trusting and suspicious, brave and afraid, and forgiving and blaming. Unfortunately, in this culture, only the positive polarity of any emotional experience is approved and allowed. This can cause such an avoidance of the negative polarity that at least two different painful conditions result. In the first, the person injures and exhausts himself in compulsive attempts to avoid a disavowed feeling, and actually becomes more stuck in it. This is like the archetypal clown whose frantic efforts to free himself from a piece of flyplate paper leave him more immobilized and entangled. In the second, repression of one end of the emotional continuum often leads to a repression of the whole continuum, and the person becomes emotionally deadened. The baby of emotional vitality is thrown out with the bathwater of some unacceptable feelings. A reluctance to participate in such a fundamental realm of the human experience results in much unnecessary loss. For just as without night there is no day, without work there is no play, without hunger there is no satiation, without fear there is no courage, without tears there is no joy, and without anger there is no real love. Most people who choose or are coerced into only identifying with positive feelings usually wind up in an emotionally lifeless middle ground, bland, deadened, and disassociated in an unemotional no man's land. Moreover, when a person tries to hold on to a preferred feeling for longer than its actual tenure, she often appears as unnatural and phony as Aristote's grass or plastic flowers. If instead she learns to surrender willingly to the normal human experience that good feelings always ebb and flow, she will eventually be graced with a growing ability to renew herself in the vital waters of emotional flexibility. The repression of the so-called negative polarities of emotion cause much unnecessary pain, as well as the loss of many essential aspects of the feeling nature. In fact, much of the plethora of loneliness, alienation, and addictive distraction that plagues modern industrial societies is the result of people being taught and forced to reject, pathologize, or punish so many of their own and others' normal feeling states. Nowhere, not in the deepest recesses of the self or in the presence of his closest friends, is the average person allowed to have and explore any number of normal emotional states. Anger, depression, envy, sadness, fear, distrust, etc. are all as normal a part of life as bread and flowers and streets. Yet they become ubiquitously avoided in shameful human experiences. How tragic this is. For all these emotions have enormously important and healthy functions in a whole integrated psyche. One dimension where this is most true is in the arena of healthy self-protection. For without access to our uncomfortable or painful feelings, we are deprived of the most foundational part of our ability to notice when something is unfair, abusive, or neglectful in our environments. Those who cannot feel their sadness often do not know when they are being unfairly excluded. And those who cannot feel their normal angry or fearful for responses to abuse are often in danger of putting up with it without protest. Perhaps never before has humankind been so alienated from so many of its normal feeling states. As it is in the 21st century, never before have so many human beings been so emotionally deadened and impoverished. The disease of emotional emaciation is epidemic. Its effects on health are often euphemistically labeled as stress, and like the emotion, stress is often treated like some unwanted waste that must be removed. Until all of our emotions are accepted indiscriminately, and acceptance does not imply license to dump emotions irresponsibly or abusively, there can be no wholeness, no real sense of well-being, and no solid sense of self-esteem. Thus, while it may be fairly easy to like yourself when feelings of love or happiness or sincerity are present, deeper psychological health is seen only when you can maintain a posture of self-love and self-respect in the times of emotional hurt that accompany life's inevitable contingencies of loss, loneliness, confusion, uncontrollable unfairness, and accidental mistake. Thus, while it may be fairly easy to like yourself when feelings of love or happiness or serenity are present, deeper psychological health is only when you can maintain a posture of self-love and self-respect in times of emotional hurt that accompany life's inevitable contingencies of loss, loneliness, confusion, uncontrollable unfairness, and accidental mistakes. The human feeling experience, much like the weather, is often unpredictably changeable. No positive feeling can be induced to persist as a permanent experience, no matter what cognitive behavioral therapy tells us. As disappointing as this may be, as much as we might like to deny it, as much as it causes each of us ongoing life frustration, and as much as we are raised and continue to be reinforced for trying to control and pick our feelings, there are still, by definition of the human condition, largely outside the province of our wills. Wow, that was a mouthful, wasn't it? As disappointing as this may be, as much as we might like to deny it, as much as it causes each of us ongoing life frustration, and as much as were raised and continue to be reinforced for trying to control and pick our feelings, there are still, by definition of the human condition, largely outside the province of our wills. Meaning we don't get to choose our feelings often, I think. That's like halfway through chapter 1, and I'm going to stop there. Thanks.